My name is Keenan Arns. I am from Cape Town. I'm turning 30 this year, and my band's name is Keenan Arns Quartet. I was about 13, 14, and I always used to see my dad playing guitar. So one night I just asked him to show me some chords, showed me some open chords, some bar chords, and then I started just figuring out songs from CDs. I used to listen to a lot of grunge music and ska and Nirvana. So I started figuring stuff out just from recordings, tabs, and then when I was about 17, I went to this place in Cape Town called the Jazz Workshop. I studied with a guy, Wayne Bosch. So he showed me the insides and the outsides of jazz music, improvisation, harmony. And after about a year of studying with him, I kind of decided that I wanted to do this full time. So I enrolled at UCT. I studied there for a year, then I studied in Norway for a year at a conservatory from a scholarship program. And came back, finished my diploma. And then I've kind of just been playing, composing, for my own band and playing in different projects and practicing, still practicing, yeah. I mean, I've gone through downfalls of being like, no, I stopped playing for maybe like a year at one point, just from personal insecurities. And maybe 2013, I think I gave it a good go again. And since then, I haven't really thought about anything else, yeah.
Thank you. Good afternoon, good day, good evening, and good morning, depending where in the world you are right now. I do know that we have some international guests who are joining with us, and we thank you very much for taking the time and the effort to be part of this lecture today. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome you, but it also gives me great pleasure to serve as the chairperson of this particular lecture too, which will be delivered by Professor Alan Busak very shortly. Before we get going with the lecture, I'm going to ask two people to give us greetings. I want to first invite the Dean of the Cathedral at St. George's Cathedral in Cape Town, Dean Michael Wieder, to say a few words, and he will be immediately followed by Dr. Llewellyn McMaster, who is the Synod moderator of the Cape Synod of the Uniting Reformed Church. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you, Professor Jerry Pillay. And just for those who have been watching and listening to the music, it's that of the late, and it still surprises me to say it, the late Andre Peterson, one of our local and international jazz musicians, a prominent pianist who passed away from COVID-related illness on Thursday past. And so we also acknowledge him for his wonderful contribution to us as a people and to global culture. So Nkosi Maibenani, Assalamu alaikum, and as our brothers and sisters on the east coast of our continent would say, Tunam shukura munga kwa, ajili yako na una tuka ribisha, meaning we thank God for you and we welcome you. And so, beloved, we welcome you to the second lecture in our Cathedral Conversations, which is part of a larger Camissa project, 50 years of Black liberation theology through the lens of Dr. Alan Busak, the fire, the river, and the scorched earth in between. Black consciousness and the liberation theology that it inspired enable us to counter the lies that redefined our African humanity from those early days when our Kuku forebears knew the place between the Hurikama mountain, the sea, and the immensity of land beyond the Lisbik. They knew it as Camissa, a place of sweet waters. Our griot, Alan Busak, was foremost then and acutely so now in enabling us, and I quote, to believe in the possibility of love, as Frans Fanon concludes in Black Skin and White Mask. And he says, that is why I endeavor to trace its imperfections, its perversions. In the 19th century, my great-great-grandmother, Maria Magdalena Stoltenkamp, belonged to the Gestigkerk, a mission church on the western outskirts of Cape Town. Membership of the Gestig secured her a burial place in the church's cemetery. And the burial ground notice board noted there for everybody passing by that it was designated for heidenen and slaven, for heathens and slaves, the perversion of the Fanonian understanding of love. The land which colonialism had dispossessed them of in life would possess them in death. And the Gestigkerk is now located in Bella, which experienced a redemptive moment in the struggle in the 1980s, one which I'm sure now that the current pastor, Dominee Llewellyn Gamka McMaster, will recall and who are now invite to share a message of support. Subralu, aware massacant.
Thank you very much, Jerry. Thank you, Michael, for this opportunity to bring this message of support as moderator of the Uniting Reformed Church in Southern Africa, the Cape Regional Synod. It gives me immense pleasure to bring our greetings and best wishes for this illustrious and distinguished project on Black theology. I believe it comes at a very opportune time for our journey as a church and theologians as we continue to wrestle with our various contexts, to interpret and to read the signs of the times, and helping one another in the exercise of sense-making. When I first listened to the young Alan Busak way back in the cafeteria on the campus of the University of Western Cape in 1976, I was still a first-year science student who would drop out of university and return later to study theology. But already in 1976, we were impressed and inspired by this gifted man of God, theologian, and incredible orator. When I was elected president of the SRC at UWC in 1984, an SRC, by the way, of which 4 of the 11 members were theology students from our church, the influence of the theology and preaching of Dr. Alan Busak and others continued to inspire and guide us, even to the point of making sacrifices for the sake of the struggle for liberation. But they helped us so that we did not feel any tension about what we believe and our commitment to the struggle. So the arrests, the tensions with our trial, solitary confinement, restriction orders, and states of emergency could not break us, but rather continue to mold us and prepare us for our ministries and leadership roles in church and society. We literally walked alongside and behind Dr. Alan Busak as he and us continue to unpack the Word of God in new, liberating ways. Our church is humbled for the work that Dr. Busak achieved within and through our community of faith. And I'm equally proud that his life's work can be unpacked through the facilitation of the Academy of Theology and Historical Research, initiated by my good friend, classmate, brother, and comrade Derek Marco, and based at the Cape Synodical Office in Belhar in collaboration with the cathedral. Churches have been in the forefront in challenging, confronting, protesting, witnessing against the justification of racism through apartheid theology, individually and within the ecumenical fraternity since the early 60s. We think, for example, the World Council of Churches Cottesloe meeting. However, at the cold face of subjugation of white apartheid theology, breaking free was a quest that took different forms at different times of our church's history. Its resistance to the Dutch Reformed Church, the so-called mother, as a representation of apartheid, reached moments of truth, making it clear where we stand. And some of these moments were 1976 with Alan Busak, where we were confronted with farewell to innocence. 1978, when the Synod of the then Dutch Reformed Mission Church clearly stated that the racism of apartheid was a structural and institutional sin, a system of oppression and injustice that was against the gospel. 1982, when the Dutch Reformed Mission Church followed the decision of the World Alliance of Reformed Churches, declared a status confessionis, stating that when the theological justification of apartheid by the church was declared a heresy, followed by the drafting of the Belhar Confession, which is a living witness to standing with and for the truth, and which was officially adopted in 1986. And of course, 1994, when 2 of the so-called daughter churches met in Belhar to form the Uniting Reformed Church in Southern Africa, with a clear rejection of the false unity within the Dutch Reformed Church family, but also taking the initiative to lead and refusing to be mere followers and recipients, both theologically, financially, and systemically. Today, 27 years on, we are deeply aware that the Uniting Reformed Church in South Africa is a reflection of the complexities to rise up and confront powers of subjugation, a reflection of the impact of the years of apartheid on all of us. But it is also a reflection of the never-ending and dynamic work and power of the Holy Spirit that enables us to learn, to unlearn, and to relearn. Dr. Busak, you are a gift to the church and society, to South Africa, Africa, and the world. And may I say, a gift that keeps on giving up till today. Thank you that you continue to challenge us to deeper reading, reflection, interpretation, and application of the Bible. Thank you for allowing us to drink from your well and standing on your shoulders. Last week, Reverend Courtney Simpson mentioned and reminded us that despite having received honorary degrees from universities across the globe, no South African university has bestowed that honor on you. It therefore fills us with great joy that our beloved UWC has decided to confer an honorary doctorate on you later this year. Thanks to Bishop Clyde Ramalain for initiating this, and especially Professor John Claassen, the head of Department of Religion and Theology at UWC, for driving it further. Today, Dr. Busak and friends, we are looking forward to sit at your feet once again, Doc, and learn from the best of the best, one of our own. God bless you. Thank you.
Thank you, Llewellyn, for taking us down memory lane and for also reminding us of the role that Professor Busak played in the church, indeed a very significant role over these many, many years. Friends, I'm sure that Professor Busak does not need any introduction. He is well known to all of us, and I'm sure all of us on this platform. But please allow me to say a few words about him. All through the years, he has stood out to be a pastor, theologian, activist, priest, scholar, and advocate for justice, peace, liberation, freedom, and equality. Who can forget his contributions in his stand against apartheid in South Africa and the quest for freedom of the oppressed and the poor? When political leaders such as Mandela and Oliver Tambo and the likes of them were in prison, it was Alan Busak and Desmond Tutu as church leaders who were in the forefront of openly defying apartheid and resisting all its forms by leading protest marches, demonstrations, calling for sanctions against South Africa and the regime of the government then, or the South African regime at that point in time, to bring it down to its knees. And indeed, they played such a big role, and Alan in particular, in mobilizing the international world to join the fight against apartheid and against the oppressive structures in South Africa. Alan mobilized the World Alliance of Reformed Churches and became its president, I think, in 1982. He mobilized the World Council of Churches to focus on the struggle in South Africa for liberation. And they became vocal and supported and resisted apartheid in South Africa during those years as well. This also impacted on the presence and participation of the Dutch Reformed Church and family in the World Ecumenical body and stage. And we know what has happened to that in terms of them being set out and then coming back in later years recently. I mention all of these as a prelude to the lecture that he will soon deliver, titled The Fire, the Water, and the Scorched Earth in Between, Black Theology and the Struggles for Liberation. Now, if you know Alan Busak, you know that when he chooses a title for a topic, every single word is loaded with information and has been very carefully chosen and selected. And so the word the title here actually speaks about the struggle towards freedom, dignity, and equity. The fires speak of the fires of revolution set by the people, as well as the burning fire inside the people for liberation, justice, and peace. And the river is a dream of freedom and wholeness, dreaming in the distance, the fulfillment of what Biko called Africa's greatest gift to humanity. And the scorched earth is the journey towards that river. This journey will take us, as you were presented today, from the resistance of South Africa's imperialism to the resistance against apartheid, to the new post-1994 struggles with the new pharaohs on this side of our Red Sea. Throughout this lecture, he will indeed wrestle with the question, how shall we reach the river of freedom, dignity, and full humanity? Now, Alan is more than qualified to speak on this particular topic, not just from a theoretical position or perspective, but most significantly from his lived experience and encounters over these many years. He was one of the first key proponents of Black theology in South Africa. His books, Black and Reformed, Farewell to Innocence, were significant contributions to highlight the social, political, and economic situation in South Africa, and especially to debunk the false notions that Reformed theology could be used to justify apartheid. He could thus claim for himself that he is both Black and Reformed, and that Reformed theology is about social justice. Black theology became a prophetic contextual people's theology, resisting empire and encapsulating the struggles, hopes, and aspirations of the oppressed for justice, liberation, and peace. And this is what we will see all the way through in this wonderful lectures and experience that Professor Busak will share with us today, and he has always shared on many platforms. But what I appreciate most about him is his consistency and spirituality. These have never left him in all his particular contributions and debates and what he has to say. And when I talk about the spirituality, the sovereignty of the Lord Jesus Christ in everything stands out for him as a prophet, priest, preacher, and activist. Alan has made huge contributions to Black theology over the years, and I am pleased that this Camissa project is bringing almost 50 years of work in this field together. I want to say well done to those who are dreaming about this, those who initiated this project, and those who have organized it. This is actually fantastic indeed, because what a way to actually accumulate the legacy of such valid, significant input over the years, telling us and challenging us about oppression, poverty, blackness, and yet in the context of all of that, the spirituality that we enjoy as people of God and people of the church. In concluding, I would also like to say what a privilege and joy it is to have Professor Busak serve as a member of the staff in the Faculty of Theology and Religion at the University of Pretoria, where I currently serve as the Dean. He is appointed as Professor in Systematic and Historical Theology, and he teaches Black theology and ethics and supervises postgraduate students. Just this week, he had a wonderful occasion of teaching the honors program, and he shared with me how exciting that is. That's precisely what Professor Busak enjoys doing. I think he comes alive when he teaches. But more particularly, as I thought about him teaching, I realized that when he does teach, he doesn't actually just gather students. He actually makes disciples. People who actually draw together and love what he says and themselves commit to it passionately because they believe that what he says and what he teaches is really where they need to go to in life. He also serves in the Dean's office as he conducts research and publishes books and helps with the internationalization of the faculty at the university. Thank you, Professor Busak, for all your contributions over these years and for the role that you play, not only in the university with me, but more particularly with churches, in the ecumenical movement, and in the academic world at large. We look forward to you lecturing today to us and sharing your experience as you share this lecture too. Professor Busak will now share the lecture with us, and immediately after that, he will be followed by two panelists who will give a response. They would be Professor Boitamelo Sanakane, and also then followed by Dr. Demaine Solomons. And the person who will be moderating from there on will be Ms. Lulundu Luwayo. So Professor Busak, without further ado, I invite you to share with us the lecture. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Pillay, for that introduction, to Dr. Llewellyn McMaster for his words of support and encouragement, to Dean Michael Weeder for making once again this magnificent place available as the space for these lectures during this series. And I thank every participant, our moderator, and our two respondents for being here today with us. I am always deeply touched and honored by your willingness to share this platform with me and to give me the privilege of working with you through these series. The title today for the lecture, as you have heard, is The Fire, the River, and the Scorched Earth Between. The struggle, the vision, and the prophetic gift of tomorrow's children. As I was putting the final touches on this lecture, our country was once again literally burning. Despite the official presidential pronouncement that this was no more than ethnic mobilization, and the superficial analysis from most mainstream media that this is all about Jacob Zuma and the common criminality of the lower classes, we know that the causes of the present unrest goes much deeper. It is hunger and joblessness, it is criminal neglect of the poor, and the unconscionable gap between the rich and the poor. It is the long, painful litany of broken promises. It is the silencing of the voices of our people, the abuse of our people's votes, their hopes and their faith, and the reckless undermining of their trust in our democratic institutions, from parliament to the courts. It is about leadership and the lack of decency, honesty, integrity, virtue, and courage. These are the things some prophetic voices have been shouting from the rooftops since the beginning of the century. And these are the issues these lectures are highlighting once again. These are the fires we are facing, and these are the very reasons why Black consciousness and Black theology are so powerfully, if painfully, relevant. Like Afrikaans in 1976, Mr. Zuma's imprisonment is just a spark lighting the smoldering embers of yesterday's wrong choices. These are the fires of destruction. Lighting the flame of hope is the gift of tomorrow's children. In the Bible, we meet the fire as the presence of God, promising liberation as in Exodus chapter 3. We have traditionally concentrated on the burning bush as the inextinguishable fire of the presence of God, producing that hallowed ground on which Moses cannot but stand on bare feet. That is a moment of magic. I would suggest, however, that we distinguish between a moment of magic and a moment of revelation. That we instead see that fire as the fire burning for justice in the heart of God, made visible for Moses to see and understand in that bush. The presence of God is the presence of justice. Here, the burning bush is God's burning desire for justice and freedom for the oppressed. It is God's unrelenting hope that we, God's children, will join God in God's struggle for our freedom and dignity as God's children. It is also God's flaming outrage against oppression and enslavement. It is a fire not even the power of the Pharaoh can extinguish. The reason why the bush is not consumed is because God's desire for justice and God's option for the oppressed will not ever be extinguished. That is not a moment of temporary magic, it is revelation. After Exodus 3, there is no burning bush, ever. There is only God's burning desire for justice, and that is revelation, eternal and unmissable. That is the fire that runs through the prophetic tradition of the Bible. Hence the repeated identification of Yahweh with justice and liberation in the prophets, from Miriam to Hannah to Mary, the mother of Jesus, and from Isaiah to Jeremiah, from Amos to Micah. That Sabbath day in the synagogue in Nazareth, Jesus decides to read from Isaiah 61. It is a deliberate choice because Jesus improvises. He reads verses from Isaiah 61, 1 and 2a, and combines them with verse 6d from Isaiah 58, deliberately. And it is because of Isaiah's persistent ode to God as God of justice in that section of his book. Nothing is random here. Beginning in chapter 51, over 10 consecutive chapters, Isaiah builds up this image of God in relentless, stunningly beautiful, and entirely convincing prose. By the time we get to Isaiah 61 verse 8, God is clear on what God loves and what God hates, the immediate juxtaposition making it inescapably final and not open to misinterpretation. I, the Lord, love justice. I hate wrongdoing, which is injustice. That is prophetic fire. And this is the fire God wants to see burning in the hearts of those fighting for justice. Martin Luther King Jr. understood it well when he spoke of the fire of the struggle as a fire that no water can put out. It is God's desire for justice that makes the struggle for justice and freedom holy ground. We also know the fire as punishment for a life of disobedience and dishonoring God and the other, as in Jude verse 7. In that image, God's self can be a consuming fire, as in Hebrew 12 verse 29. There is also the image of the fire that will test the sort of work we have done on earth, as the Apostle Paul uses it in 1 Corinthians 3:13. The prophet Jeremiah feels the God-induced urge of his calling to speak the word of prophetic truth as a fire shut up in his bones, and I cannot hold it in. In the stories of ancient Israel's deliverance from slavery, the river Nile, simultaneously a source of life and a harbor of great danger, becomes the place where Miriam takes her stand and stands her ground, carrying upon her young shoulders the future of the liberation of her people. The river Jordan becomes more than a river. It is a moment of great consequence, a time for grave decisions, an ever-flowing challenge to cross over to a new, entirely different way of life in an entirely unknown country. For Israel in exile, their suffering in a foreign land, and in their longing to return to their home, their tears flow stronger than the rivers of Babylon. But the Bible also knows the river as source of the promise of hope and life. bringing equal joy to the heart of God and to the hearts of God's children. Superseding all metaphorical expressions, it then becomes the river of joy. The first time the river is mentioned in the Bible is in Genesis chapter 2, embedded in the creation story. There, at first glance, it is mentioned only in its geographical space and in its functionality. A river flows out of Eden to water the garden, Genesis 2, verse 10 to 14. But already here, the river serves a deeper purpose. It splits into 4 rivers and becomes an indicator of the richness of the earth and of the prosperity of the nations in whose lands the river is directed to flow. The land of Havilah, according to Josephus and the church fathers, the Ganges Valley in India, or perhaps a section of the land of Abyssinia, the land of Cush, the land of Syria. In the river Euphrates, last in the list in Genesis 2, verse 14, it rises in what is today known as Turkey, flows southeast across Syria and Iraq to the Persian Gulf, all the lands known then as Mesopotamia. So right at the very beginning of creation, the river serves as a symbol of life, prosperity, and hope for all the nations known in that time. This hope-giving insight of the inclusivity of God's rich abundance will echo again in the very last book of the Bible. In Cape Town, the Camissa River, now running only underground as it leaves Table Mountain, is the place where, after the first defeat of the Portuguese in 1510, the historical struggles for the possession of the land against the Christian invaders who came with the intent to settle began in earnest in 1652, followed by the battles on the banks of the Liesbeek River. Vincent Harding, writing about the historical and spiritual journeys of African Americans, captures it all in the title of his book, There is a River. And of course, there is the inimitable Howard Thurman's enduring classic about the meaning of the spirituals. Deep River and the Negro Spiritual speaks of life and death. But between the river as the presence of a liberator God whose heart burns for justice and the river as an all-inclusive, life-giving promise of God, there is the scorched earth of unspeakable suffering, of enslavement and of annihilation, of deadly disobedience and fatal unfaithfulness, of oppression of Israel by empires of every kind, and oppression of the poor and the destitute within Israel. There is the scorched earth left behind by Israelites themselves as robbers of land and the stealers of dignity, and the scorched earth of pharaohs without and pharaohs within. There would be false prophets and corruption of the Torah, exploitation of the faith of the lowly, and the murder of the innocents. The temple will be turned into a den of thieves. The poor will be trampled into the dust, their lives not worth the price of a pair of sandals. The prophets will be reviled, rejected, and killed, and Jesus will weep over Jerusalem. There will be a beheading and a crucifixion because the powerful cannot bear the truth spoken by the true prophets of God. Scorched earth. In the course of our journey, black oppressed people had begun to understand that we had to identify and expose the fundamental and indispensable ideological power matrix that sustained imperialism, colonialism, and apartheid. Second, the power of a theology designed to justify, sanctify, and deify imperialist power, to protect at all costs white privilege, white impunity, white supremacy, white innocence, and white victimhood. We deliberated the uniqueness of apartheid. And it was not just about white supremacy and white racism in general, and not just the belief that they were a people elected by God, formed by divine providence, and sent to Africa to fulfill a God-given destiny. All those we find in the Puritans who swamped the lands of the Native Americans, of the Africans, and it is also true of the Zionists in Palestine. This is land theft on a scale so grand, it is perhaps, comparatively speaking, only matched and surpassed by the state of Israel today. In 1948, at the time of the Nakba, 98% of what is today known as Israel belonged to Palestinians. And of course, here are the real people of God, not the fake ones we met in America and in South Africa, straight from the pages of the Bible, following the letter the scenes from the book of Joshua, especially as we find that in chapter 9. What made apartheid unique, however, is not that Afrikaners believed in it and that they took random texts from the Bible to prove their rightness. White American Christians did that also. On top of a white racist interpretation and an apartheid exegesis of selected portions of the Bible, they constructed carefully and deliberately a theology of apartheid, drawn from their interpretations from one of the most vigorous theological traditions, the Reformed tradition. The tradition, as Michael Walzer so eloquently argued, that gave the world the first intellectualized theory of political revolution. However, they accomplished a vital and important twist. They took Calvin's quite radical theology of social justice, blended it with German Nazi-inspired Volksromantik, and created a racially exclusivist theology of white domination and black subjugation, disguised as justice in separate spheres, as F.W. de Klerk would insist in his stubborn and repeated defense of apartheid, totally estranged from the intentions of the reformer. On no other place on earth did this happen in this way. Because of this history, black Christians embracing the Reformed tradition carried a special burden. What does it mean to be part of this tradition when the tradition is the source of apartheid, the justification for the most unashamed racist expressions of white supremacy, the most draconian laws, the most obnoxious policies, the worst kinds of brutalities, and all in the name of Jesus, and theologically, intellectually, and academically, claiming the Reformed tradition as its source of inspiration? This foundation for biblical and theological rightness gave the Afrikaner Calvinists and their churches a sense of unshakable security. But simultaneously, it was their greatest point of vulnerability. Because the Word of God is a two-edged sword, because God will not be mocked, and because people created in God's image are meant for freedom and full humanity. They are not meant for enslavement, and they will always fight for their freedom. Thus, Black Reformed Christians became better equipped to join our sisters and brothers from other faith traditions in the struggle for the liberation of all South Africa's people. My own theological education at the hands of white DRC professors was not suitable, and they were not remotely willing to provide the answers to our burning questions. The theology of apartheid, the security of their own white status, and the insignificance of our black pain left no room for self-reflection, self-correction, and for the spirit of conversion. If I wanted to learn more, I had to look elsewhere, and I did. The structures of power intimately intertwined with the ideologies of imperialism and colonialism, of which apartheid was the spawn, were complex realities we should understand so that we should know what we were fighting against. The people defending those realities were learned and sophisticated. Hence, the necessity for activists to not be afraid of learning. I was denied proper learning in apartheid South Africa, but those 6 years abroad in the Netherlands, learning about the radical reform tradition and about Dietrich Bonhoeffer, hero of the resistance against Hitler, and especially in the United States, being introduced to the holy rage of James Cone and the incomparable wisdom of Gaylord Wilmore, the untamable power and prophetic logic in the preaching of Jeremiah Wright, the history and faith of the black church in the United States, and the history of the civil rights struggle. All of these were invaluable, irreplaceable, and indispensable tools for my own participation in the struggle at home. This historical reality is what gave rise to black and reformed apartheid, liberation, and the Calvinist tradition from 1984. For black reformed Christians suffering under the tyranny of apartheid, the anomaly was almost unbearable. The question fundamental and decisive. Was the Afrikaner version of the reformed tradition, the equation between being reformed and being oppressive and racist, justified? What really lies at the heart of the reformed tradition? And it is only in the Netherlands where my eyes were opened to the radical Calvin and a world opened up to me. It is not enough, writes John Calvin in his commentary on Isaiah 58, verse 6 to 7, to abstain from acts of injustice if you refuse your assistance to the needy. In other words, it is not just about not doing injustice, as if that is the fulfillment of God's commandment. Calvin says, it is about two things: the undoing of injustice and the doing of justice. Moreover, it is not about those we find acceptable for some reason. It is about all God's children, created in God's image, and therefore our flesh and blood. From Calvin's commentary on Isaiah 58, I quote, by commanding them to break bread to the hungry, God intended to take away every excuse from covetous and greedy men who allege that they have a right to keep possession of that which is their own. And indeed, this is the dictate of common sense, that the hungry are deprived of their just rights if their hunger is not relieved. Note that Calvin does not talk about charity or just giving out of the goodness of my heart. He talks about the rights of those who are hungry. At length he goes on, the prophet concludes, and that you hide not yourself from your own flesh. And here we ought to observe the term flesh, by which the prophet means all humans universally, not a single one of whom we can behold without seeing as in a mirror our own flesh. It is therefore proof of the greatest inhumanity, says John Calvin, to despise those in whom we are constrained to recognize our own flesh. John Calvin insisted that, quote, the name neighbor extends indiscriminately to every person, because the whole human race is united by a sacred bond of fellowship. Therefore, to make any person our neighbor, it is enough that they be human. And we claimed all of this for ourselves in the struggle against all forms of racism and exclusion of all kinds. The end result is now well known. It is the black Christians from the Reformed tradition who, inspired by the liberation theology we discovered in Calvin, and having made part and parcel of our own black liberation theology, that took on the white Dutch Reformed churches, taking their case to the World Alliance of Reformed Churches in 1982, and had apartheid declared a sin and its theological justification a heresy and a blasphemy. In our times across the world, we are learning that despite the devastating dominance of the COVID-19 pandemic, we are facing not just one crisis, but a multiplicity of crises. Since Frantz Fanon correctly identified colonialism as a veritable apocalypse, we can likewise say that Western Christian invasion, imperialism, colonialism, and capitalism were veritable pandemics inflicted upon colonized peoples the world over. In post-1994 South Africa, as in post-Obama, post-Trump America, there are the fires of harsh, merciless imperialist rule, global, unrelenting, profit-driven, neoliberal capitalist exploitation, the politics of vicious, ethnocentric, sometimes religious nationalism, leaving behind scorched earth and no room for the flourishing of humanity. Homophobia, transphobia, and bigotry of all kinds are hunting down God's LGBTQI+ children, crushing their human beingness and destroying their lives as if these do not matter. Mindless greed fueled by incomprehensible solipsism, self-centeredness, and self-aggrandizement has literally set fire to the earth and an irreversible destruction of Mother Earth, causing the extinction of whole species on the earth, in the waters, and in the skies, poisoning her rivers and oceans, incinerating the trees and withering the flowers. In an assault from hell upon creation and upon the generations to come, they rip from her bosom the most vulnerable of her children, leaving their emaciated bodies like the bodies of Michael Brown on a sidewalk in Ferguson, Missouri, and David McAtee in Louisville, Kentucky, lying in the sun, burning with an intensity we have not ever felt before. But in the air-conditioned corporate boardrooms, where they jubilantly count the profits and celebrate their political victories, they do not smell the smoke nor the stench. Neither do they see the handwriting on the wall. The mene, mene, tekel, upharsin will remain unintelligible because among the willful, powerful, there is no Daniel to tell them what that means. There is no Daniel because they have killed all the prophets, like they killed Malcolm X and Martin and Biko. And those remaining, they have silenced and banned from their midst, as they murdered Oscar Romero in El Salvador, and as they silenced Jeremiah Wright in the United States with President Obama's full consent and cooperation. The struggle for the return of our land, stolen by colonialists through war, conquest, and the insult of sheer trickery, which began in the Cape of the Kooi in 1510 and in earnest in 1652, is being waged on scorched earth. This was the birthplace, writes People's historian Patrick Tariq Mele, of those first struggles on the banks of the Camissa River, of the dynamics of what in later years became known as the land question. He says, Van Riebeeck arrived with a plan and building materials to erect a fortification next to the fresh water. The struggle over the control of the Camissa was symbolic of the struggle for ownership of the part of the town that grew from that first settlement of the Amakwa. So the passion for the fight of the land does not begin in 1913, but in 1510, and with colonialists with intentions of becoming settlers in 1652. Not so long ago, I was requested by a theological journal to review a PhD dissertation. And this is what I wrote in that review. Seldom have I felt so conflicted about a book. Ndiko Mchishelwa's book is a study of the question of the redistribution of the land, one of the most burning questions in South Africa's political and public discourse. It is a brilliant scholarly study through which the author brings liberation theology's hermeneutical suspicion to a reading of Leviticus 25 and the question of the Jubilee here, through which the author, and the question of the engagement of the classic approaches of historical criticism and analysis. Throughout the book, the author argues that a correct understanding and interpretation of the biblical Jubilee here is not only necessary for a correction in our political discourse, but can also make a positive contribution to the practical issues surrounding the redistribution of land. It is a masterful use of the master's tools, breaking down the methodologies and teasing out and exposing the ways in which these approaches have been used to the detriment of justice in the questions under discussion. At the end, Mchishelwa's liberationist analysis, interpretation, and conclusion stand like a rock. So why am I so conflicted, I wrote. In the introduction, Mchishelwa decides that his book will be about, quote, indigenous black peoples of South Africa who are of African descent, end quote. The others, quote, the indigenous peoples, including the Khoi and San peoples, are not included in the phrase African South Africans. Now this raises fundamental questions. Why leave them out at this very moment when this question is of utmost importance to Khoi, San, and Nama people and their descendants, and the descendants of the enslaved population from the early colonial days? Who decides that 1913 is important, but 1652 is not? Among the many other serious questions, here is one of the most serious for me personally. Who decides that I am not an African South African? Denying one's African's being and history is too serious a matter not to address, even in one single section of such an important book. So politically and emotionally, this is one of the most egregious assaults the ANC has waged against a whole section of our indigenous population. In this case, the Camissa people of the Cape, and it is deeply disappointing to find that same arbitrariness in a study of this quality. So for all my joy at reading this excellent work, there is a pain, since every time the author speaks of Africans, socio-economic justice, dignity, and humanity through the restoration of the land, he does not mean me. The question the title of his book raises, to whom belongs the land, is a question ripped from my own heart, since it does not include me. And it leaves the question unanswered. And the host of African children also are excluded, who sprang from the Camissa people. That, in my view, is scorched earth. Over the weeks of preparing these lectures, I, like all of us, was shocked, disgusted, and terrified by the scenes that came from East Jerusalem, Palestine, and Gaza. The viciousness of the fascist Israeli apartheid regime, the vileness of the complicity and the cowardice of the United States government and the European Union, and the blood-stained blasphemies of Christian Zionists were on full display. The Biden administration is caught in the shame of total exposure of all its wrong choices, with one hand waving the flag of feigned concern, while with the other hand stoking the fires by selling even more lethal weaponry to Israel and protecting Israel in the Security Council of the United Nations. The Europeans, still floundering in the unrepented guilt of their own anti-Semitism, instead of repenting by making the right choices this time, are trying to wash their hands in the blood of those same Palestinians who must now pay the price for the multiple and ongoing sins of Europe. And such is their shamelessness that they, after decades of aiding and abetting the worst forms of violence by the state of Israel, dare to stand on the sidelines as if they were neutral, calling for restraint on both sides, shouting peace, peace, where their own hypocrisy has made peace impossible. And just 2 days after the so-called ceasefire, Israel was once again locking down Gaza. And now that international attention is all on the next word from Joe Biden, Israel continues to arrest and kill Palestinian activists. The refusal to understand that the issue is not Gaza, or the war between Gaza and Israel, or even the meaningless regime change in the Knesset, that the issues are stolen land, an apartheid state that has made peaceful coexistence impossible. The issues are the right of return, human rights, dignity, security for the Palestinian people, and the creation of a non-racial, secular, inclusive, and truly democratic state. That refusal is scorched earth. But at the same time, we watched, awed by the courage of the young Palestinians, who in wave after wave of non-violent protest swamped the Israeli government and their military forces, facing down the brutality, the propaganda, the lies, and the half-truths, not at all intimidated or beguiled by their misguided, inept, and cowardly leadership in Ramallah, keeping the power in the hands of the people and keeping their minds focused on the issues that matter. It was an awesome sight. Youthful, determined feet marching across the scorched earth of the Holy Land, all shouting in unison, and the world now beginning to shout with them in ever greater numbers, from the river to the sea, Palestine shall be free. That is the fire burning for justice and freedom. So, to say it with that matchless poet from ancient Persia, Omar Khayyam, the moving finger writes, and having writ moves on, nor all thy piety nor wit shall lure it back to cancel half a line, nor all thy tears wash out a word of it. But the feast of fools in power and the fools with power goes on, and they do not see it. This is not just one crisis that we, in our bloated arrogance, think we can manage. It is the lynching of creation, as it is the lynching of God's black children, as it is the lynching of women. This is not just a political, economic, or a race crisis. It is, as German theologian Jürgen Moltmann writes, a God crisis. Moltmann says, our social and political frigidity towards the disadvantaged, the poor, and the humiliated is an expression of our frigidity towards God. The cynicism of modern political and economic manipulators is an expression of our contempt for God. We have lost God, and God has left us. So we are bothered neither by the suffering of others which we have caused, nor by the debts we are leaving behind for coming generations. Writing his letter to the Romans, the Apostle Paul had no idea how right he would be proved. God's whole creation is now groaning in anguish together with the children of the earth. Creation's labor pains are now the groaning of all humanity. Who would have thought that those groanings Paul heard would now be trapped in the throat of one black man, choking to death, whispering on behalf of all humanity and all creation, "I can't breathe." But there are also the fires of global solidarity and resistance, burning bright in their multicultural, international, intergenerational, intersectional, intergender gloriousness, standing their ground on the scorched earth, fighting their way through the dark towards the light, reaching for the living waters of the river of freedom and justice. In 1963, James Baldwin published his unsurpassed The Fire Next Time. It contains a letter to his nephew titled Down at the Cross. It is a superb and passionate piece of writing describing the times in which Baldwin lived. He makes of it a prophetic call for justice and courageous engagement for the sake of justice. He ends the letter with a reference to an old black spiritual, a plea, a prayer, and a warning all at once. God gave no other rainbow sign, no more water, but the fire next time. Historically, as a people and as a church, we are at a strange, unexpected, and disconcerting place. In our times, James Baldwin's The Fire Next Time is still the fire this time. Ahead of us, real enough to believe in, but still too distant to see, are the living waters of the river of freedom. In between is scorched earth. It is a time for black prophetic activism. At the end of the 1960s, activists in the United States helped inspire our own Steve Biko with their philosophy of black consciousness and their cry for black power. Guided by Biko's insight, the strongest ally of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed, we set to work by reclaiming our rightful mind. In preparation for our struggle, we embraced what I have come to call the fivefold functionality of black consciousness, as critical and self-critical, liberating, empowering, engaging, and humanizing consciousness. We embraced our blackness and we forged a black solidarity by discarding the ethnic labels and division forced upon us by colonialism and apartheid, and by rejecting apartheid's pigmentocratic political hedonism. We were done with being labeled Bantus and Indians and coloreds. What we should at all times look at, Steve Biko advised us in words as timely and relevant today as they were then, 50 years ago, is three things. One, we are all oppressed by the same system. Two, we are all oppressed in varying degrees as a deliberate design to stratify us, that is, to set us up one against the other, socially as well as in terms of our aspirations. And three, this is done deliberately. And therefore, we have to be as deliberate to fight this at every level with all the commitment we could muster. Black consciousness meant revolt, not only against what white supremacy expected, but also against what white supremacy needed. White supremacy needed our submissiveness, our inferiority, our compliance, and our complicity. And we refused. It was the first phase of what I would later call the politics of refusal. Whereas the ANC proposed a non-racial, non-sexist democracy for South Africa, black consciousness vowed to work for a non-racial, non-sexist, egalitarian democracy. The difference is not small. For black consciousness, South Africa should become a democratic socialist society, and unlike our ruling classes then and now, we saw no hope or future in new liberal capitalism. Like our comrades in the United States, we embraced the wisdom handed down to us from our forebears, Henry Highland Garnet, Frederick Douglass, Martin Luther King Jr., and Albert Luthuli, when they said, "Power concedes nothing without a demand." And that understanding was foundational to the Soweto Revolution, which started on June 16, 1976, a time for decision and a historic turning point. So in 1979, at the annual conference of the South African Council of Churches, and now under black leadership for the first time, namely that of Bishop Desmond Tutu, black delegates argued for the church not just to support individuals who broke apartheid laws for the sake of justice, but to support and embrace radical acts of massive civil disobedience. We knew we stood on firm theological and scriptural grounds, and so did I when I defended the SACC's decisions and actions in an open letter to the then Minister of Justice, Alwyn Schlebusch. So the politics of refusal joined hands with the theology of refusal. Joining the youth in the streets of protest, the church became a truly prophetic church. Not the institutional church that would always be ambivalent about the revolution, but what Frank Chukani called the church of the streets. The time for pious words was over. Now let me quickly turn to some of the lessons we have learned along the way. First, we should perhaps begin with Latin American liberation theologian John Sobrino. The first task of Christian liberation theology, he writes, is to try and to attempt honesty toward reality. It is a difficult task, he says, because not only is our world characterized by institution systems of injustice and violence, it is also characterized by the politics and systems of concealment of injustice and violence. That makes it extremely difficult for us to be honest about our reality. And I agree with him. Because the forces of imperialism, oppression, racism, and patriarchy, white supremacy, and enslavement benefit from both the violence and the injustices, as well as from the concealment thereof. We must expose the politics of violence as well as the politics of concealment. Second lesson, let us not be afraid to experience and show the prophetic rage that is so characteristic of the biblical prophets. They rage not only because of what they see around them. They rage because they see what and as God sees. It is the rage of Elijah before King Ahab, of Moses against the elites of Jerusalem, and of Jesus in the temple square. It is the holy rage of Miriam and of Ella Baker, of Charlotte Nkleke and Katie Lowe, of the prophet Jeremiah and of Jeremiah Wright. How is a prophetic theology without rage possible after the lynching of Emmett Till and Solomon Mashlango, of Steve Biko and George Floyd, of the children of Soweto and Elsis River and of Flint, Michigan, of Sandra Bland and Breonna Taylor, after the massacres at Elaine, Arkansas, and Tulsa, Oklahoma, after Sharpeville and Marikana? Third lesson, we should be vehemently on guard against the looting of what young Gerald Robinson Brown from England calls the linguistic arsenal of the poor and the oppressed. The ruling classes appropriate the language of the struggling masses for themselves and for the establishment, putting it in service of empire, in service not of justice but of justification and appeasement, thereby rendering the language ineffective, if not totally meaningless. What in post-1994 South Africa is the meaning of the word freedom, and as defined by whom? Or reconciliation, when it comes without remorse, repentance, or conversion, without justice, reparation, and restitution. And after Nelson Mandela and Barack Obama, what remains of the true meaning of the word hope? And with American mass media, what remains of calling every single centrist imperialist in American politics a progressive? Bandied about the word revolution, bandied about by too many who remain captured by our present unjust systems. If that is the case, who will let the world know the difference? Reclaiming the language of the oppressed as the linguistic arsenal of the poor, the destitute, and the truly hopeful is the great task facing us today. Fourth, we can no longer ignore that we are living in an imperial world and that the power of American empire is a power devastating not just of the rest of the world, but of the poor, the oppressed, and the vulnerable in the U.S. itself. We cannot ignore the fact that what womanist theologian Paula McGee called the new black church, completely swallowed up by the ideology of new liberal capitalism, single-minded individualism, mindless consumerism, and patriarchy, and at war with every tradition of the prophetic black church. That black church is a product of American fundamentalist imperialism. The harm it is doing to the church and to societies in Africa and elsewhere in the global south is indescribable. American empire is fatal for the world, and it is fatal for African Americans and for every poor and disadvantaged person everywhere. Fifth, as then, there is now a revolution going on. The Black Lives Matter revolution, encompassing all calls for justice, equity, freedom, and dignity, is engulfing the whole world. And we are in the midst of it. The issues are undeniable. The challenges are unavoidable. The call is clear, and neutrality is no longer possible. Christians are called to join that revolution for freedom, dignity, and for humanity's wholeness. And we must join, not to Christianize the struggle, but as Albert Lutuli said, I will join the struggle, taking my Christianity with me, praying that it will influence for the good the character of the resistance. And finally, we have learned the costly lesson that both Steve Biko and James Cone warned us about. A black face in office is no guarantee for justice, dignity, and equity for our people. Identity politics is the death of revolution. It is the grave of the sacrifices of our people over centuries. It is the wilted flower along the trail of tears, along the stony road we trod. It is still the sting of the chastening rod. It is not skin color or gender or sexual persuasion that makes the difference, we have learned. What makes the difference is the dedication and commitment to justice, dignity, and equity, the courage to stand up against empire, and the respect for the sacrifices of the people. Throughout the years of struggle, we have been sustained by hope. But it is not the hope that American social critic Chris Hedges called the mania for hope, gripping so many of us. The mindless, unthinking, blind optimism that disenables, paralyzes, and disempowers us. I prefer to cling to the hope African church father Augustine teaches us. And he speaks of hope as a mother with two daughters, and they are called anger and courage. Anger about the wrongs we see about us, and the courage to go out and do something about it. Today in South Africa and in Palestine, in Myanmar, in the United States and in Britain, in Mali and the Sudan and Algeria, the fires of discontent are still smoldering, and the living waters of the river of freedom and dignity are still much too distant. The scorched earth between us is our burnt-out hopes, our discarded ideals, our trampled upon dreams, our spat upon sacrifices. The stench we smell here is of the promises of our Constitution set alight by corruption, greed, and criminal indifference. It is the smell of solidarity wounded by bigotry and selfishness, of social cohesion immolated by racism, ethnocentricity, and narrow nationalisms. It is a smell of trust willingly offered, but now decaying on the ash heap of disdain and a failed reconciliation process. COVID-19 has brought for the church multiple crises and challenges at levels of intensity as we have never seen in our lifetime. Far from being the so-called great equalizer, it has exposed the long-entrenched fault lines of racism, poverty, inequality, and willful neglect in our societies across the world as never before. COVID-19 is, however, a new added layer of scorched earth. And so, yes, we do feel helpless, fragile, and vulnerable, racked with unnameable fears and countless uncertainties and rightful anger. But we are not abandoned. There is a river. Sol Plaatje knew it when in 1916, 3 years into the devastation of the 1913 Land Act and at the beginning of a new phase of resistance, he wrote, "The one thing that stands between us and despair is that heaven has not yet deserted us." We knew and believed it when, by the grace of God, we were setting new standards for Christian involvement in the Defiance campaign of the 1950s and in the civil rights struggle of that same period, and since the Nakba in Palestine. We knew and believed it when our people were massacred in Sharpeville in 1960, again in Soweto and Cape Town and in Port Elizabeth in 1976, and again in Langa Township in Uitenhage in 1985, when Archbishop and I, Desmond Tutu and I, buried 27 people at one funeral service, all massacred on the same day. We knew it through the years of protest and confrontation and slaughter throughout the 1980s. And we know it and we believe it now after the massacre at Marikana in 2012. And the different but very real slaughter of our people through poverty and hunger, neglect and disdain, corruption and kleptocracy, through the slaughter of our dreams, ideals, and hopes for the future. God has not abandoned us. And so we marched and we resisted, we danced and we sang, laying our bodies on the line, Akana mandla usatani. The power of Satan is broken. That is the faith that inspires us today, and all of those of us who believe in a new tomorrow. It is the prophetic gift of that tomorrow's children. There is a river whose living waters may glad the city of God, says Psalm 46, verse 4. The earth changed, the mountains shake into the heart of the sea. Its waters roar and foam, the mountains tremble with its tumult. But there is a river. That is the hope, that is the dream, that is the faith that makes and keeps us strong for the work of liberation, justice, dignity, and peace. In the final chapter of his apocalypse, John sees a river. The river of the waters of life, bright as crystal, flowing from the throne of God. That throne sits in the city of God, which is gladdened by the justice of God that is unstoppable, by the peace of God that is never ending, and by the undeniable dignity of God's people, which is anchored in the love of God. But John's vision does not end there. John takes us back to the beginnings, to Genesis 2. But in embracing that image, John totally flips it. In Genesis, as we have seen, the tree of life is planted in the garden into which the river flows. That is a sign of hopeful life, an invitation to courageous faith, and a call to obedience. But also planted there was the tree of good and evil. Now, and that tree is a contradictory presence, an omen of things to come. The tree of good and evil becomes the source of a deep and terrible alienation from God, who is the real source of life. Its presence disrupts life in the garden and ends in the banishment of the humans once so close to God. It culminates in a tragedy that would have no end. Only 2 chapters on, Cain would murder his brother Abel, and in becoming brotherless, he becomes godless. It is the story of the incomprehensible tragedy of human existence, the shattering power of human self-centeredness and self-destruction and estrangement. It is the story of the dreadful beauty and fragility of human relationships. In the Genesis creation story, the tree of life is mentioned no more. But here, in the book of Revelation, John sees it again. On either side of the river, there is now a tree of life bearing life-giving fruit. Planted not in the garden, that Eden, now tainted by disobedience and estrangement, by hatred and envy and the blood of the vulnerable. That Eden, once an exclusive garden, is now broken wide open, embracing God's whole world. Not in Eden, as if kept for the joy of only a select few, but in that new earth, under that new heaven, on either side of that life-giving river. On either side. So if, like the river Nile, the river flows from south to north, people will come from south and north and west, and they will come from north and south and east. And on either side, they will find a tree of life. And that is not all. In John's vision, there is no mention of a tree of good and evil. Why? Because he writes, nothing accursed will be found there. All the contradictions and the paradoxes are overcome. There is only a tree of life. And no, it is not some otherworldly eschatological dream. It is John's vision for a this-worldly, entirely different tomorrow. But even that is not all. The leaves of the tree are for the healing of the nations. John radicalizes this image. The richness, the prosperousness, the joy the river offers is no longer limited to those few nations only mentioned in Genesis. God's grace, God's generosity, God's embrace is for all the nations. Not a single one is excluded, not a single one left behind, not a single one pushed to the margins. Not a single one shall hunger, not a single one shall thirst, not a single one shall remain broken. Because they are all of them, God's precious children. There is a river, and on either side is the tree of life, and the leaves of the tree are for the healing of the nations. So, from Mitchell's Plain in Khayelitsha in Cape Town, to Tigray in Ethiopia and Tahrir Square in Cairo, in Latin America from the burning heart of the Amazon to the stretching coast of Chile, and to the mountains of Peru, and from the forests of Guatemala to the barrios of Mexico. In the United States, from the sacred grounds of Standing Rock to the blood-soaked banks at Wounded Knee, where 300 Lakota Sioux were slaughtered. And from Money, Mississippi, where Emmett Till was lynched, to the hallowed place at George Floyd Square in Minneapolis, where George Floyd was murdered. From Jerusalem, where Jesus was crucified, to the streets of Ramallah and Gaza, where Palestinian children are crucified. They will come and they will drink from the waters of the river that are for the healing of the nations. Here, in one single image, is the radical, invisible justice of God. the radical, indivisible equality of God, the radical, indivisible solidarity of God, the radical, indivisible inclusivity of God. Oh yes, we know that behind us are the fires, underneath our feet is the scorched earth, but before us, glittering like crystal, there is a river, and it flows from the throne of God. And that is why a black prophetic revolution is necessary. And that is the struggle, that is the vision, and that is the prophetic gift of tomorrow's children. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Professor Bosak for what is an equally rich and stimulating second lecture. To move our conversation along, I have the pleasure of introducing our panelists who are going to give us a response and some engagement with this second lecture. The first of our panelists is Professor Boitumelo Sekonowane, who is an associate professor at UNISA in the College of Human Science in the Department of Philosophy, Practical and Systemic Theology. He is currently seconded as Director of Engagement, Coordination and Projects in the Office of the Vice Principal, Institutional Development, and is a member of the UNISA Council. Professor Sekonowane is also a minister in the Uniting Reformed Church of Southern Africa in the Lakeside Congregation, and also serves as the General Secretary of a trade union called the Academic and Professional Staff Association that is based largely in the university, and is also an NEC member of the South African Federation of Trade Unions. Over to you, Professor Sekonowane, for your response.
Thank you very much, and afternoon to everyone listening to this conversation of today, but mostly to Dr. Alan Bosak. It's obviously a privilege for me, since that within the United Reformed Church, some of us who grew in this church have modeled ourselves by his teaching and also his theoretical skills and his participation in politics and the society in general. The issue of reading the response, of course, I had to try to read some books, but I've realized that they couldn't be accessed within the country. 3 books came to mind when I was preparing for this. The Fire Within is the first one, the second one, Children of the Waters, and the third one, Black and Reformed. I did that deliberately because the expectation of this lecture was to at least respond using or through the eyes or the spectacles of Professor or Dr. Alan Bosak. In my response, I chose to title my paper as follows: I Can't Breathe. If I had powers or given a blank check to rename this lecture, I would opt and use the words quoted by Alan Bosak in page 11 of this paper or the lecture, stating I can't breathe. There are 3 reasons why I will do that. Firstly, the actual title, The Fire, the River, and the Scorched Earth, unquote, directly and indirectly refers to the absence and or lack of breathing. More than half of fire-related deaths results from the smoke inhalation. Inhaling harmful smoke can inflame your lungs and airways, causing them to swell and block oxygen. This can lead to acute respiratory distress syndrome and respiratory failure. The first and second opening lines of the paper or lecture equally support my choice of the title, as Bosak admit, I quote, "As I'm putting the final touches on this lecture, our country is once again literally burning. Burning because of hunger and joblessness, conditions that suffocate the poor. Oxygen concentration are much higher in air, and when there is smoke, there is disturbance. Therefore, I can't breathe. Secondly, there are many sources of oxygen. That includes the air and inflowing streams. The water that flows in the river is fresh, meaning that it contains less than 1% of salt. However, rivers still carry and distribute important salts and nutrients to support plants and animal life. For this reason, some of the most biodiverse habitats on our planet can be found around rivers. It goes without saying that clean water is essential for humans and nature to survive. Rivers are precious sources of fresh drinking water for people across the world. The river ecosystem sums the interactions between plants, animals, and microorganisms, and between them and non-living physical and chemical components in a particular natural environment. Just like animals and humans living on land, animals that live in water need oxygen to survive. Oxygen from the atmosphere dissolves in river and lake water, and it is the oxygen that fish and other aquatic animals use to breathe. When water is in creeks and rivers pour over rocks, oxygen can enter the water. Oxygen level depends on whether water is flowing or not, whether there are rocks or other obstacles for water to flow over, how many plants are growing in the water, and the temperature of the water. There is more oxygen in cold flowing water with many obstacles and moderate amount of plants. Busak's choice of the river as a metaphor can be fully grasped in his book titled Children of Waters of Meribah, Black Liberation Theology, specifically when he disclosed, I quote, "One more rivers to cross" is a line from a well-loved Black spiritual firmly rooted in the faith traditions in African American in their struggles for freedom. It was formidable Vincent Harding in his groundbreaking work, Who, with the Exodus story and the history of the struggles of African American people as intertwined frameworks for understanding terms of a river as a metaphor, unquote. Busak argues in this book that the river carries within its bosom our ancient selves, the dreams, hopes, failures, and amazing achievements of our ancestors, and the whole lesson we have to learn from them, lest we lose sight of who we are to be and perish. It is more than us, and its waters will nourish the hopes and visions of new generations, the struggle for justice and dignity, for possession of our aspirations. I can't breathe. Thirdly, the scorched earth, a reference to slightly burnt, damaged by fire or heat. Merriam-Webster Dictionary defines the scorched earth as follows, I quote, "relating to or being a military policy involving deliberate and usually widespread destruction of property and resources, such as housing and factories, so that an invading enemy cannot use them," unquote. In our context, our earth is caused by the enemy and equally by ourselves, obviously based on the Merriam-Webster context. This indirectly refers to the Pharaoh on both sides. Both leave us with the breathing difficulty. We are left without trees and plants. As we all know, when we breathe, our body takes in oxygen and releases carbon dioxide. During photosynthesis, plants absorb carbon dioxide and releases oxygen. This opposite pattern of gas use makes plants and people natural partners. At night, photosynthesis ceases, and plants typically respire like humans, absorbing oxygen and releasing carbon dioxide. But a few plants do the opposite, taking in carbon dioxide and releasing oxygen. In addition, plants purify air by removing toxin, up to 87% of volatile organic compound, otherwise known as VOCs, every 24 hours. VOCs include substances like formaldehyde present in rugs, vinyl, cigarette smoke, and grocery bags, etc. I can't breathe. In conclusion, while many are arguing about the contempt of court, for Boesak, the fundamental is a contempt of creation. This is a Calvinistic view that defines Boesak theological tradition, creating suffocating environment and condition is that contempt of creation, and thus undermining God's creation. When we read Genesis chapter 2, verse 7, it says, and I quote, the Lord God formed the man of dust from the ground and breathed into the nostrils the breath of life. And the man became a living creature, unquote. But as we speak, I can't breathe. Thus says the poor, the unemployed, the hungry, the widows, the oppressed, the exploited, and etc. This brings the conclusion of my response. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Prof, for circling back to that important line, I can't breathe. I have the pleasure then of introducing our second panelist and respondent to today's lecture, Dr. Demaine Solomons. Dr. Solomons grew up in Bishop Lavis and teaches systematic theology and social ethics in the Department of Religion and Theology at the University of the Western Cape. He is a Mandela Rhodes Scholar and the recipient of numerous academic awards, including the NRF Desmond Tutu Doctoral Fellowship. He is a graduate of the University of the Western Cape, as well as the Vrije Universiteit of Amsterdam, where he completed his doctoral studies. Demaine's research encompasses moral philosophy through a Black theological lens, and his work is predicated on the notion that God suffers with humanity while also promising a better future through the hope of resurrection. I invite him now to share with us his response.
Moderator, thank you for the introduction. Special thanks to the Camissa project team for this wonderful initiative. Of course, to dream is but the first step in the realization of the good, a society that we all long for. Today, you have transcended that. Personally, this is a momentous occasion. Having the opportunity to engage the work of a public intellectual, Professor Alan Boesak, who without a doubt had the biggest impact on my development as an emerging scholar, a proponent of Black liberation theology. So if I appear a little bit starstruck, that is because I am. Hopefully it is not too obvious. Prof, I note your concern when you say that your theological education at the hands of white DRC professors was not suitable. For many of us, the study of academic theology, at university especially, can be quite brutal, somewhat alienating, because for the most part, you study the words of white men who, if you are anything like me, a laity from the Vaal Fletcher in Bishop Lavis, you quickly realize that they often speak of me and on my behalf, having no idea who or what I am. The confidence with which they do this is nothing short of astonishing, carefree, self-assured, in most cases lacking the ability to question themselves. In amazement, you sometimes long to have but some of that chutzpah, but quickly realize that such indulgences are problematic at the best of times. Inversely, you, the student of the discipline, are groomed to accept or engage superficially, that is, with the thoughts of these so-called giants of the field, conforming to their way of being and doing. Your intelligence or worth is measured against your ability to recall or at least mimic that which is considered canonical. With their voices echoing beyond the grave, the slaves of academic theology constantly remind us of the importance of these custodians of the discipline, men who, even if they were alive today, would have very little understanding or perhaps even interest in the religiosity of Antipatsy in Charlesville, Boeta Orbs in Bonteheuwel, or Uncle Seppi in Bella. Fortunately, among the many things you learn on the Cape Flats is never trust anything or anyone who, as we say colloquially, appears to be too sure of themselves. Die een se bek is te glad. Be careful, approach with caution. Nevertheless, my despair is not total. In doing what we do, we also get to experience the liberative force of theology, not just in narrow academic terms, but in ways where your whole sense of self and how we engage with the discipline is transformed psychologically and otherwise. In this sense, what was shared explosively as only Alan Busa can do is a stark reminder of the words he penned more than 40 years ago in that theological classic, Farewell to Innocence, a socio-ethical study of black theology and black power. Judged over a period of time, Farewell to Innocence is more alive today than when it first appeared in Kampen in the Netherlands in 1976. Already here you see the hallmarks of a scholar who shows very little interest in the folly of theological abstractions, whilst also not shying away from the high level of intellectual engagement needed to address some of our most pressing concerns. True to the teachings of the liberation paradigm, he does what very few theologians are able to do. That is, speak to me, engaging my reality, my condition, on being black in a society where anti-black sentiments and white supremacy go together like a cup of coffee and a kosista on a Sunday morning. In conversation with Biko, Busa calls us to bid farewell to a non-white mentality, a release from theological and ideological slavishness, moreover calling black and white South Africans to interrogate their so-called innocence or pseudo-innocence, if you will, in light of a liberation that remains elusive. A poignant reminder that we buried apartheid in a shallow grave too close to home, as he once intimated. In this unfolding epistemological drama, he engages the oppressed as his main interlocutor, a methodology that is both humane and uncompromising. Here, the emphasis is on a theology from below vis-a-vis a theology from above, the latter which generally describes Western theological thought, at least insofar as emphasizing philosophy as a starting point. So, whilst Western-centered theological frameworks define its interlocutor as the non-believer, a black theology of liberation's main interlocutor are those considered non-persons, folks on the underside of history, the hungry, the jobless, women, those we despise in economic terms, the so-called looters of KwaZulu-Natal and Gauteng, because how dare they unsettle the comforts of the most unequal society in the world. In this way, a black theology of liberation is an epistemological rupture, a total shift in paradigm, challenging not just the canon in theological terms, but also the gatekeepers of the status quo, those who thrive under the racism and the life-denying neoliberal economic practices that define South Africa as we know it. The liberation paradigm, the heart and soul of black theology, therefore provides the rootage in supporting the spiritual as well as the physical needs of the oppressed through the construction of a concrete program, Camissa, for their emancipation to be realized not just as an eschatological reality, but also in history. Today we are reminded that the liberation paradigm provides the theological tools that are not only consistent with, but forms the very basis of the gospel of Jesus Christ. In Busak's words, and I quote, liberation is not merely part of, nor merely one of the key words of the gospel, but it is the content and the framework of the whole biblical message, end quote. He goes a step further by expanding the semantic range of liberation, not just in narrow political terms, but in this case, salvation in Christ is equated with and given meaning in the liberation of the poor and the oppressed. In other words, liberation is instrumentalized to express the longing that arises from the innermost desires of those who are marginalized. This creates an environment in which the oppressed open themselves to receive the saving love of God. Properly understood, liberation beyond the 1994 nostalgia includes liberation from the new pharaohs, those who look like us and speak our language. Liberation from different forms of oppression and servitude. Moreover, liberation from sin that breaks the relationship with God and her people. To liberate is to give life. To give life is to sanctify. Liberation as sanctification does not substitute social justice for inward piety, nor is it an exclusive political endeavor. Instead, it goes to the heart of God's eschatological future, addressing both the spiritual as well as the immediate needs of our people. In concluding, the fire, the river, and the scorched earth in between is not a call to be nostalgic. After all, it is Boesak who alerts us to a new generation asking the question, what lessons have black theology not learned? The resistance of young people and their anger, women and their struggle against patriarchy inspires a new vision that denies death and affirms life. The development of theologies by women, in addition to class and race constructs that deny black peoples their dignity and life, is an expression of the power of the oppressed to say an unequivocal no to the pharaohs on both sides of the blood-red waters. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Domain. Thank you for that. We now come to the point in the afternoon where we have some time for some questions and some engagement. I'm going to have a look around the very sparse audience here at the cathedral to see if there are any hands. I don't know if we have a mechanism for taking questions from people who are watching remotely. We do? Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to start then with people who are in the cathedral. So there's the gentleman here in the white shirt. I don't see any other hands. So let's begin with you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Boesak. This question comes from 2 or 3 weeks ago when we were first here. My question would be to Professor Boesak, do you think it's possible that we can save this earth by practicing a theology that stems from a region where people were serving the light, serving the sun? The question is therefore, can it be possible that a theology that not respects the earth, as we call it, Mother Earth? A couple of years ago, I was fortunate in responding to a metaphysicist who were arguing the similarities and the commonalities of the faiths that started in the north. In the north, to the extent where people were for many years serving and praying that the light would come, and in that, building a theology on the expectation that when the light will be shining. Opposite to that, in the African, especially the Southern African states, there was an indigenous knowledge system which in which the spirituality was really showing the way that we are from this earth. And if you see how people are neglecting the earth, whereas the indigenous faiths, right from the onset, were honoring the earth. There's a work from one of my friends who titled his book, The Struggle of the Ancient Faiths. And to me today, to discuss the rescue of the earth only within the parameters of Christianity falls completely short if we don't look around and see the importance of indigenous faiths who will be bringing out and who will be helping the scorched earth.
Thank you very much. I'm then going to read one or two questions from our online platform. The first is a comment that reads that it's ironic how we struggle in the church with justice and how it's not important as salvation, even when we have a history and a heritage of justice. The second then is a question. Why do you only blame Afrikaners for apartheid when the English also did the same thing in South Africa, and are the English exonerated? The next question, they silenced the prophets Malcolm, King, Wright, and Biko. Can we include Louis Farrakhan? And what does the silencing of the prophets symbolize for Black consciousness and civil dissident or guerrilla preaching? And what does that symbol mean? I'll take one more and allow you to respond. The fourth, Baldwin in his book, The Fire Next Time, says that white people are, and I quote, our lost younger brothers with love. Love must force them to see themselves as they are, end quote. Can you comment on how we can prevent this scorched earth without us scorching them in our quest for true emancipation? I'm going to pause there and allow an opportunity for response. Dr. Bosak?
Thank you. How much time do we have left?
We've got about
8 minutes. Thank you so very much for all of these questions. Let me begin quickly, and I will not be able to answer, of course, all of the questions, nor in the detail that I would like to. But for the question here from the floor in the cathedral, I come back to this question of the environmental justice, eco-justice, and the role of theology in the last lecture. And in the last lecture, I include, that is the lecture that talks about the new generation to whom we are handing over the baton. In these lectures, the younger theologians like Dr. Solomon's next to me and Professor Senekwane in Pretoria and all of the others who are part of this project and wider. Yes, it is not possible to speak only of our relationship to the earth from within the Christian faith. Of course not. We have to, in our case, return in many ways to the faith of the indigenous people whose symbiotic relationship with nature, with the earth, with everything else around us has set an example that has been obliterated almost for too long. But in all the conversations now, even in our conversations on COVID, I have suggested to the World Communion of Reformed Churches that we include in our conversations the people who represent those ancient indigenous faiths whose remedies for a wholeness of life are becoming more relevant than ever now. And of course, with that comes the battle to make sure that those remedies are not appropriated and commercialized and stolen by Western pharmaceutical companies, if you talk about medicines. But all of the other ways of spiritual life and spiritual reconnectedness with nature, that seems to me to be part of this. And I mentioned that in the last lecture as well, but that is a very good point that you are making. I will quickly run down these questions that I have. The question about Baldwin, white people are our lost younger brothers, and we must talk about this without scorching them, and we must win them over with love. That is absolutely true, but you will know that for Baldwin, as for Martin Luther King Jr., love without justice, love without honesty, love without integrity, love without correction is meaningless sentimentality. And so we have been telling white people from as long as anybody can remember that we do not want your blood on our hands like our blood is on your hands. Lutuli said so 1,000,000 times. And so did every black leader from the very beginning. The question is that white people have always misunderstood our love as subjection to their superiority and as a forgiveness that for everything that they had done without them making amends, without them showing any remorse or repentance. Love requires the restoration of genuine human relationships, which begins with an honest appraisal of what has caused the alienation. In Pharaohs on both sides of the blood-red waters, I have a whole chapter on Paulo Freire's The Obligation of the Oppressed Towards the Oppressor. I wish the person who asked that question would please read that book and would read that chapter and see how that is played out in our situation today. So as far as I'm concerned, the hand is stretched out to white people, have always been. Albert Lutuli has said he is afraid that the hand would not be taken because it is a black hand. And today, I have seen that hand being stretched out and that hand being slapped away because white people refuse to be honest about their past and our past and what has happened to us through them in South Africa. And unless we have that honesty, talking about love is pure sentimentality. So I hope that we could come to that point. There's a question about why do I blame Afrikaners only while English-speaking people are as much to blame. Again, in 2005 already, in the tenderness of conscience, I have a whole section of how the Afrikaners had come with their brand of apartheid, but how the English had set the example and the patterns already long before the Afrikaners came to power in 1948. And how after 1948 it was very, very clear that not only the Afrikaners could turn their back on any kind of recognition of what they had done, and I recall the DA that reacted so vehemently when there were some white people in the 1990s who said that white people must come together and talk about how they would make reparation. And how people from the DA were saying that English-speaking people did not benefit from apartheid. They simply did what they had to do under difficult circumstances. Now that is hogwash. And so I'm not blaming the Afrikaners only in today's lecture. I was talking about how the Afrikaner Calvinists use the Reformed tradition and the legacy of John Calvin to create the theology of apartheid and what that meant for those of us in the black community who were also children of the Reformation and the Calvinist tradition. And that is why the emphasis was on them today. But English-speaking South Africans are not by any means whatsoever exonerated. Every time I use the terms white supremacy, white racism, white superiority, imperialism, colonialism, that excludes white people in general in this country and in the world at large. There is a question about whether the church has a prophetic word for the ANC. I thought that I had started this lecture with a word to the ANC who is now in power and to the president. And if that person will continue to listen to these lectures, we will come back to our ruling classes and our ruling elites time after time after time in these lectures. Also, I would recommend that person to go and read what I have written in Tenderness of Conscience in 2005, in Radical Reconciliation in 2012, in Pharaohs on Both Sides of the Blood Red Rivers in 2017, and in Children of the Waters of Meribah from 2019. In every book, I hold up the church as a prophetic voice against the rulers of our time. And I in fact blame the church in South Africa that after 1994, we had not just lost our prophetic voice as if it happened to us. I think we gave away our prophetic presence and our prophetic witness after the African National Congress came into power. And we were not nearly as honest and as clear and as prophetically bold towards the ANC government as we had been towards the apartheid government. And so, no, I would hope that that person would continue to listen to these lectures and would hear how we are dealing with these issues. I did not mention Minister Farrakhan because Minister Farrakhan is not in my orbit as much as Jeremiah Wright, for instance, or as Malcolm X was in my orbit. And I think that Mr. Farrakhan is much more of a different figure than Malcolm X. Malcolm X left the black nationalist viewpoint that was in vogue in the 1960s and the 1970s and the early 1980s, which Malcolm X had left already in the 1960s. And I have a greater spiritual kinship with Malcolm X and, of course, with Martin Luther King and Jeremiah Wright and Albert Lutuli than I have with Minister Farrakhan. Not to say that I do not respect his point of view, but his point of view is a point of view that I cannot for myself embrace. And that's fine, because we are allowed to differ from one another. I don't know how much time we have left, but it seems to be... Are we done? Thank you so very much. This was once again a wonderful opportunity today. I regret that we cannot respond to all of the answers, but we will find a way to engage with those who can get those questions to us. So thank you very much, and good evening from my side. Moderator.
Thank you very much. My apologies all. Time is never on our side, and there's really never enough time to fully have these discussions. I now am going to hand back to Professor Pillay to close this evening's event.
Thank you for moderating this session. And as they've already said, I mean, just when we start to warm up and have some real good conversations, time is never enough. And I want to thank all those who have joined us for just a little bit, 2 minutes more than 2 hours. You've really been good at it, and thank you so much for that. If you could just allow me a quick minute just to say thank you to a few people. I'd like to say a very sincere thank you to Professor Boesak. One of the amazing things about him is that he's always robust, energetic, and vibrant in his delivery. And the amazing thing is he's never mellowed with age. So thank you, Alan, for that. But yet also thank you for a very profound, prophetic, and provocative delivery in terms of your lecture, which you usually inspire us and make us think intellectually, critically, realistically, contextually about things. That is sincerely appreciated. Thank you so much. Thank you to those who brought greetings to us, Dean Wieder and Dr. McMaster. Thank you to our panelists, Professor Nakane and Dr. Solomons, and also to our moderator for this session today. Just a reminder quickly, as Professor Boesak said, this is a continued series and there's actually 8 lectures in total. We are now with lecture 2, so we have 6 more to go. And I just want to remind you that on the 14th of August will be the next lecture. And I trust that you will join us again and look forward to further inspirational thoughts and gems from Professor Boesak as we tie all of these things together and bring all these things that has been saying over the years, and more particularly with regards to Black liberation theology, that continues to challenge us in our present situations and context, and also given all the crises that we continue to face not only in South Africa, but worldwide. Thank you, everybody. God bless you. Thank you for being with us. It's much appreciated. Bye-bye now. Take care.